I'm Michelle Lopez, 42 years old, and 3 months ago, a racist incident happened at the Grand Meridian Hotel that changed everything. I stood there watching white guest after white guest get immediate service while I was ignored, dismissed, and treated like I was invisible. But what the hotel management did next was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in hospitality, retail, or any service industry, please let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. My story starts where many of ours do, meeting us with parents who believed education could armor us against the world's prejudices. Growing up in Detroit, my mother Constance worked double shifts as a nurse, while my father Jerome taught high school history. Sunday dinners at our house weren't just about my grandmother's famous cornbread and collard greens, they were strategy sessions. "Baby girl," my father would say, cutting into his sweet potato pie, "you're going to have to be twice as good to get half as much. But don't you dare let that stop you from demanding everything you deserve." I absorbed those lessons through church youth programs at Mount Calvary Baptist, where Mrs. Henderson taught us public speaking and debate. She'd make us practice our white voice for job interviews, then switch to our authentic selves for community organizing meetings. "Code switching isn't selling out," she'd explain, "it's survival strategy." My best friend Tamika and I would laugh about it later, but we both knew she was preparing us for battles we'd face in corporate America. My academic journey took me from Wayne State University to Harvard Business School on scholarships I fought tooth and nail to earn. Those early days in Cambridge were brutal, being one of maybe 15 black students in my MBA program, constantly questioned about affirmative action, having professors assume I was there on athletic scholarships when I'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in economics. But my study group included Sylvester, a brilliant brother from Oakland, who taught me that excellence was its own rebellion, and Dr. Patricia Williams, the only black professor in our program, who became my mentor and showed me how to navigate predominantly white spaces without losing myself. After business school, I spent 5 years climbing the corporate ladder at McKinsey & Company, specializing in hospitality industry consulting. I learned every facet of luxury hotel operations, from revenue management to guest experience optimization. My reports were cited in industry publications, and I was invited to speak at the National Hotel Association's annual conference twice. More importantly, I made sure to pull other people of color up with me. I mentored young professionals through the National Black MBA Association and established a scholarship fund at my alma mater. But it was starting my own consulting firm, Lopez Hospitality Solutions, that truly established my reputation. Within 3 years, I had contracts with major hotel chains across the Southeast, implementing customer service training programs that increased guest satisfaction scores by an average of 23%. My approach combined data analytics with cultural competency training, teaching staff to recognize and address their unconscious biases while improving service delivery. I'd worked with the Grand Meridian chain before Mayonnaise. They'd hired me the previous year to revamp their customer service protocols at their Atlanta location. That project was so successful that their corporate headquarters reached out about expanding our partnership. I had meetings scheduled with their executive team to discuss a potential 6-figure contract that would revolutionize their approach to inclusive hospitality. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to experience firsthand just how much that training was needed. The day started like any other Tuesday. I woke up in my downtown condo, did my morning meditation while Erykah Badu played softly in the background, and chose my favorite navy blue Tahari suit, the one that made me feel powerful and confident. I had my presentation materials perfectly organized, my laptop charged, and my talking points memorized. This was supposed to be a celebration meeting, the culmination of months of relationship building with Grand Meridian's executives. As I pulled up to the valet stand at the Grand Meridian Chicago, I noticed how the attendant immediately rushed to help the white businessman who'd arrived after me, practically ignoring my presence until I specifically asked for assistance. A small microaggression, but I filed it away. Media in my line of work, I'd learned to recognize these patterns. Walking through the opulent lobby with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, I felt that familiar hypervigilance that comes with being a black woman in luxury spaces. Every detail mattered: median, my posture, my clothing, my speech patterns. I was representing not just myself, but every black person who would walk through those doors after me. The first sign of trouble came when I approached the concierge desk to confirm my meeting location. The young white woman behind the counter looked right through me, continuing her conversation with a colleague about weekend plans. I waited and waited. Meanwhile, I watched her immediately assist three white guests who arrived after me, offering detailed recommendations and warm smiles. When I finally cleared my throat and asked for assistance, her entire demeanor shifted to cool professionalism bordering on hostility. But I had no idea that what happened next would test every lesson my parents taught me about dignity, strategy, and fighting back. My family didn't just prepare me for success, they prepared me for war. Not the kind with weapons, but the psychological warfare that comes with being black in America. Every Sunday after church at Mount Calvary, my extended family would gather at my grandmother's house on 7 Mile Road. Between helpings of her famous mac and cheese and debates about the Lions' latest disappointing season, we'd share stories and strategies about navigating white spaces. My Uncle James, who'd been one of the first black executives at Ford Motor Company, would tell us about boardroom dynamics: how to speak with authority, how to document everything, how to build alliances. Always have your facts straight, he'd say, adjusting his glasses, because they'll question your competence before they'll acknowledge their racism. My Aunt Denise, a social worker who'd fought institutional bias in the child welfare system for 20 years, taught me about emotional regulation under pressure. Don't let them see you sweat, baby. Your composure is your power. These weren't just family stories, they were survival manuals passed down through generations. My grandmother Ruby had cleaned houses for white families in Birmingham before moving north during the Great Migration. She'd seen enough to fill a library with cautionary tales, but she'd also raised children who became teachers, nurses, and business owners. Her lessons were simple but profound. Respect yourself first, because the world will try to convince you that you don't deserve it. And never ever let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness. In corporate consulting, I'd become an expert at reading rooms and people. I could spot bias from across a conference table, the slightly longer pause before someone responded to my ideas, the way my credentials were questioned when my white male colleagues were accepted without discussion, the compliments about how articulate I was. I'd developed strategies for each situation, building coalitions with allies, documenting everything in writing, choosing my battles strategically. My professional identity was built on cultural competence in the truest sense. I could switch between my authentic self with my family and friends to my corporate persona without missing a beat. At home in my neighborhood, I was Michelle who brought potato salad to block parties and argued loudly about which Beyoncé album was her best. At work, I was Miss Lopez who spoke in measured tones and peppered my presentations with data points and industry jargon. The morning of November 15th started with my usual routine. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., spent 20 minutes in prayer and meditation while gospel music played softly in the background, then reviewed my presentation materials one final time. The Grand Meridian contract represented more than just business growth. It was validation that my approach to inclusive hospitality could scale nationally. If successful, it would position me as the go-to expert for diversity and inclusion in the hospitality industry. I arrived at the Grand Meridian Chicago at exactly 10:45 a.m. for my 11 a.m. meeting. The valet situation should have been my first warning, but I was focused on the bigger picture. Walking through that lobby, I felt the familiar weight of representation. Every interaction would be scrutinized, every response analyzed. I was not just Michelle Lopez, consultant, I was a black woman in a space that typically served people who looked nothing like me. The concierge incident escalated quickly. After being ignored for nearly 10 minutes while white guests received immediate, enthusiastic service, I politely but firmly requested assistance. "Excuse me. I have a meeting with your executive team and need directions to the conference room." The young woman, her name tag read Jennifer, looked at me with barely concealed irritation. Are you sure you're in the right hotel? Our meetings are typically by invitation only. The question hit like a slap. I'm Michelle Lopez from Lopez Hospitality Solutions. I'm here for the 11 a.m. meeting with Director of Operations Patrick Wright about our consulting contract. Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, needing not to apologetic, but to suspicious. She made a show of checking her computer, typing slowly and frowning at the screen. I don't see anything here. Are you certain you have the right date? I pulled out my phone and showed her the email confirmation, the calendar invite, the entire paper trail. She glanced at it dismissively. Well, I'll need to make some calls. You can wait over there. She gestured vaguely toward a seating area near the entrance. Nowhere near the comfortable lounge where other guests waited. That's when I knew this wasn't about confusion or inefficiency. This was about power, control, and a young white woman deciding that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in this space. As I walked to the designated waiting area, I felt the familiar cocktail of rage and determination that my family had taught me to channel into strategy. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. I watched Jennifer continue to serve other guests with efficiency and warmth while pointedly avoiding eye contact with me. When I approached the desk again, she sighed dramatically. I told you I'd call when I had information. Please return to your seat. The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. This wasn't customer service. This was a power play designed to make me feel small, unwelcome, and insignificant. But Jennifer had no idea who she was dealing with. I had documentation, witnesses, and 20 years of experience turning discrimination into accountability. I decided to document everything. When I first reported the incident to hotel management, I naively believed that presenting facts would lead to swift justice. I was wrong. The meeting with Director of Operations Patrick Wright and Guest Services Manager Patricia Holbrook felt like a carefully choreographed performance designed to gasoline my concerns while protecting their employee. Miss Lopez, we deeply regret any misunderstanding that occurred during your visit. Wright began, his tone suggesting I was being overly sensitive. Jennifer is one of our finest team members, and I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for any confusion. The word misunderstanding was doing heavy lifting, reframing clear discrimination as a mere communication error. I presented my evidence methodically, the timestamps showing I'd waited 35 minutes, while 12 white guests received immediate service, the email confirmations proving my meeting was legitimate, and the witness statements from other guests who'd observed Jennifer's behavior. Holbrook nodded sympathetically while taking notes, but her responses felt scripted. We appreciate you bringing this to our attention. We'll definitely look into improving our communication protocols. The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. Perhaps Jennifer was having a difficult day, Wright suggested. Our staff work under tremendous pressure during peak seasons. When I pointed out that discriminatory behavior couldn't be excused by stress, Holbrook intervened with, "Of course not, but we want to consider all factors before jumping to conclusions about intent." Jumping to conclusions. As if 35 minutes of documented discrimination required additional interpretation. What specific steps will you take to address this? I asked directly. The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if they'd expected me to accept their vague assurances and disappear. Wright cleared his throat. We'll certainly review the security footage and speak with Jennifer about proper customer service protocols. Beyond that, we'll need to conduct a thorough investigation before determining appropriate next steps. The timeline they proposed was insulting: 2 to 3 weeks for an initial review, followed by additional time for a comprehensive analysis. No acknowledgement of harm caused, no immediate accountability, no recognition that this behavior reflected deeper institutional problems. They were buying time and hoping I'd lose interest. But the most revealing moment came when I mentioned my consulting work with their Atlanta location. Suddenly their postures shifted. Wright's eyes narrowed slightly, and Holbrook stopped taking notes. "You're in the hospitality consulting business?" Wright asked, as if this information changed everything. "That's interesting. I hope you understand that any public discussion of this incident could be misinterpreted as an attempt to leverage your professional relationships with our company." The threat was unmistakable. They were suggesting that seeking justice for discrimination could be reframed as professional misconduct or attempted extortion. It was a masterclass in institutional protection, deflect, delay, and discredit. I left that meeting with crystal clarity about what I was facing. This wasn't about one employee's bad day or communication breakdown. This was about a system designed to protect discriminatory behavior by making the reporting process so exhausting and demoralizing that victims would simply give up. But they had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. The retaliation began within days of my meeting with hotel management. Suddenly, Patrick Wright wasn't returning my calls about our pending consulting contract. Patricia Holbrook, who'd previously been enthusiastic about expanding our partnership, claimed she needed additional approval from corporate for decisions that had already been finalized. The shift was dramatic and deliberate. 3 months of relationship building evaporated overnight. Emails that would have received responses within hours now went unanswered for days. When I finally reached Wright by phone, his tone was markedly different, cold, distant, and professional, in a way that felt punitive. Given recent developments, we've decided to pause our consulting engagement while we reassess our strategic priorities, he informed me during a brief call that felt scripted. Recent developments. As if my reporting discrimination was a business complication rather than a legitimate grievance that required addressing. The contrast with how my white colleagues were treated became increasingly obvious. During industry events, I watched Wright warmly greet other consultants, including several I'd referred to Grand Meridian for smaller projects. He'd engage them in lengthy conversations about potential partnerships while pointedly avoiding eye contact with me. The message was clear: reporting racism would cost me professionally. Meanwhile, my attempts to follow up on their promised investigation hit bureaucratic stone walls. Holbrook claimed the review was ongoing, but couldn't provide timelines or updates. When I requested copies of security footage, I was told it required legal department approval that could take weeks. Every inquiry was met with delays, deflections, and requests for additional paperwork. But the community support I received told a different story. Tamika, my best friend since childhood who now worked in civil rights law, immediately recognized the pattern. "They're trying to exhaust you," she explained over dinner at our favorite soul food restaurant in Southfield. "Make the process so bureaucratic and time-consuming that you'll eventually give up. It's classic institutional racism: protect the system by punishing anyone who challenges it." My professional network rallied around me in ways that restored my faith in collective action. Sylvester, my former Harvard study partner, who now ran his own consulting firm, connected me with other Black consultants who'd faced similar retaliation. Dr. Patricia Williams, my business school mentor, provided strategic advice about documenting everything while building external pressure. The National Black MBA Association chapter in Chicago offered to connect me with legal resources, while the National Association of Black Hotel Owners and Operators issued a statement supporting my right to report discrimination without professional retaliation. These weren't just networking connections. They were a community of people who understood that my fight was their fight. As weeks passed without resolution, I realized the hotel's strategy was working exactly as intended. The stress of fighting discrimination while managing professional retaliation was exhausting. I found myself second-guessing interactions, wondering if other potential clients had heard whispered warnings about the difficult consultant who creates problems. The psychological toll was exactly what they'd hoped for. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed I was fighting alone. By December, the Grand Meridian's institutional response had evolved from denial to aggressive victim blaming. What started as claims of misunderstanding escalated into character assassination designed to discredit my allegations and protect their system. The new narrative, delivered through carefully worded communications from their legal department, painted me as a disgruntled consultant using false discrimination claims to leverage business advantages. Upon thorough investigation, their formal response stated, "We found no evidence of discriminatory behavior. Rather, the evidence suggests a pattern of unprofessional conduct by Ms. Lopez designed to manipulate normal business disagreements into discrimination claims." The gaslighting was sophisticated and systematic. They reframed my 35-minute wait as standard protocol during peak periods while ignoring the documented evidence that white guests received immediate service. My detailed documentation became obsessive behavior that demonstrated unreasonable expectations and confrontational attitudes. Even my professional qualifications were questioned. They suggested my consulting recommendations were unnecessarily focused on racial issues and demonstrated poor business judgment. Most insidiously, they weaponized respectability politics against me. My direct communication style was labeled aggressive and difficult to work with, while my insistence on accountability was characterized as unwillingness to engage in reasonable dialogue. They were essentially arguing that I should have accepted discrimination gracefully to maintain my professional reputation. The institutional protection racket was textbook corporate racism. Jennifer, the concierge who discriminated against me, was quietly transferred to a different department with no apparent consequences. Management framed this as career development opportunity rather than disciplinary action. Meanwhile, they implemented enhanced customer service training, a token gesture that allowed them to claim they'd addressed the problem without acknowledging discrimination had occurred. Their legal strategy focused on controlling the narrative before I could build public pressure. They filed preemptive complaints with industry associations, claiming I was using unfounded discrimination allegations to harm their reputation. They contacted mutual business associates, spreading carefully crafted versions of events that portrayed me as vindictive and unprofessional. But the most revealing aspect of their response was what they didn't do. No acknowledgement of harm caused. No apology for the documented mistreatment. No genuine investigation of systemic bias in their operations. No policy changes to prevent future discrimination. Their entire strategy centered on protecting the institution and its employees from accountability. The message was clear. Grand Meridian would rather destroy my professional reputation than admit their employee had discriminated against a black woman. They'd weaponize every tool at their disposal: legal intimidation, professional retaliation, character assassination, to maintain the fiction that discrimination hadn't occurred. They were about to learn that I'd been preparing for this fight my entire life. The breaking point came on January 8th, when Grand Meridian made their racism undeniably public. After weeks of behind-the-scenes retaliation and character assassination, they decided to escalate their attack in the most humiliating way possible. I was scheduled to present at the National Hospitality Innovation Conference in Chicago, a prestigious industry event where I'd spoken successfully for 3 consecutive years. My presentation topic was inclusive excellence, building customer service that serves everyone. Ironically appropriate given recent events, 2 hours before my scheduled presentation, I received a call from conference organizers. "Ms. Lopez, we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your presentation," said conference director James Morrison, his tone uncomfortably formal. "We've received information suggesting that your consulting practices may not align with our conference standards." Information? From whom? We both knew the answer. The character assassination was swift and brutal. Grand Meridian had contacted conference organizers, sharing their carefully crafted narrative about my unprofessional behavior and tendency to manufacture discrimination claims. They'd reframed my expertise in inclusive hospitality as evidence of problematic bias rather than professional competence. "Several attendees have expressed concerns about potential controversies surrounding your presentation," Morrison continued. "In the interest of maintaining a professional atmosphere, we think it's best to postpone your session until these matters are resolved." Postpone indefinitely, he meant. Remove me from the program to appease their corporate sponsors. The public humiliation was deliberate and devastating. In an industry where reputation is everything, being disinvited from a major conference sends a clear message to potential clients and colleagues. Grand Meridian wasn't just punishing me for reporting discrimination, they were attempting to destroy my career as a warning to others who might challenge institutional racism. But their attack backfired spectacularly. The conference decision to remove me sparked immediate outrage from attendees who recognized exactly what was happening. Dr. Patricia Williams, who was attending the conference, immediately understood the implications. "This is retaliation, pure and simple," she announced to a group of Black hospitality professionals gathered in the hotel lobby. "They're trying to silence her by destroying her professional platform." Word spread quickly through social media and industry networks. The hashtag #StandWithMichelle began trending among hospitality professionals of color, with hundreds sharing their own experiences of discrimination and retaliation. The National Association of Black Hotel Owners and Operators issued a statement condemning the conference's decision and Grand Meridian's behavior. The community mobilization was swift and powerful. Sylvester organized a boycott of Grand Meridian properties among Black business travelers. Tamika connected me with civil rights attorneys who specialized in employment and public accommodation discrimination cases. The National Black MBA Association offered legal support and media advocacy. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Wright, Patrick Wright's sister and a professor of organizational behavior at Northwestern University, reached out with information that would change everything. "I've been watching this situation unfold," she said during our private meeting at a coffee shop near campus. "What my brother doesn't know is that I've been researching discrimination patterns in hospitality for my upcoming book, and Grand Meridian is a case study in systemic racism." She had documentation, internal emails discussing customer demographics and brand image concerns, training materials that coded racial profiling as intuitive security assessment, performance evaluations that consistently rated Black employees lower than white employees for identical behaviors. Most damning, a series of communications between Patrick Wright and other executives discussing how to handle the Michelle Lopez situation without admitting liability. "They're not just discriminating against you," Dr. Wright explained. "They're part of a broader pattern of institutional racism that affects employees and customers. And I have 5 years of data to prove it." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Grand Meridian hadn't just discriminated against me, they'd created a culture where discrimination was normalized, systematized, and protected. Their retaliation against me was simply their standard operating procedure for maintaining that system. It was time to take them to court. The formal hearing took place on March 15 in the Cook County Courthouse, an imposing limestone building that had witnessed decades of civil rights battles. I arrived early, wearing my burgundy Tahari suit, the one that made me feel powerful and connected to my grandmother's lessons about dignity under pressure. The marble corridors echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations as attorneys, journalists, and community supporters gathered for what had become a landmark case. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The front rows were filled with my legal team from the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, led by attorney Sylvester Jefferson, not my business school classmate, but a fierce advocate who'd built his career fighting institutional discrimination. Behind them sat my community, Tamika, my parents who'd driven up from Detroit, Dr. Patricia Williams, and dozens of hospitality professionals who understood that this case would set precedents for the entire industry. On the opposite side, Grand Meridian had assembled an army of corporate attorneys from 3 different firms, their expensive suits and leather briefcases projecting the kind of power that's designed to intimidate. Patrick Wright sat stiffly beside them, avoiding eye contact, while hotel executives whispered urgently among themselves. They'd clearly expected this matter to disappear quietly, buried under bureaucratic delays and professional pressure. The media presence was significant but respectful. Representatives from hospitality trade publications, civil rights organizations, and local news outlets filled the gallery, understanding that this case addressed discrimination patterns that extended far beyond one hotel chain. This wasn't just about my experience, it was about accountability for systemic racism in American hospitality. Judge Maria Santos called the court to order with gravity that acknowledged the broader implications of the case. "We're here to determine whether discrimination occurred, and if so, what remedies are appropriate to address both individual harm and systemic problems," she announced. Her words carried weight that made everyone understand this was about more than monetary damages. Grand Meridian's defense strategy was predictable but sophisticated. Lead counsel David Richardson, a silver-haired attorney who specialized in defending corporations against discrimination claims, opened with character assassination disguised as reasonable doubt. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Ms. Lopez is a disgruntled consultant who fabricated discrimination claims to leverage business advantages and damage our client's reputation, when her consulting contract wasn't renewed. Their narrative painted me as vindictive, opportunistic, and professionally unethical. They presented my documentation as evidence of obsessive behavior and my community support as proof of manufactured controversy. Richardson argued that any delays in service were due to standard protocols during peak periods, and that my professional qualifications made me hypersensitive to normal business interactions. But their defense crumbled when we presented the evidence Dr. Sarah Wright had provided. Internal emails revealed explicit discussions about maintaining appropriate clientele and brand image standards that were clearly coded language for racial profiling. Training materials included instructions for staff to be especially attentive to security concerns when serving guests who didn't fit typical customer demographics. The smoking gun was a recorded conversation between Patrick Wright and other executives discussing my case. "We can't admit any wrongdoing." Wright's voice was clear on the recording. "If we acknowledge discrimination here, it opens us up to dozens of similar claims. Better to discredit her professionally and hope she goes away." When Jennifer Martinez, the concierge who discriminated against me, took the stand, her testimony revealed the depth of institutional bias. Under cross-examination, she admitted she'd been trained to assess guest legitimacy based on appearance and demeanor. When pressed for specifics, she couldn't explain why a professionally dressed Black woman with confirmed reservations required additional verification while white guests received immediate service. "I was just following protocols," she repeated, but couldn't articulate what those protocols were or why they seemed to disproportionately affect guests of color. Her discomfort was palpable as she realized her actions were being scrutinized in open court rather than protected by corporate policies. The institutional pattern became undeniable when we called additional witnesses. 3 other Black professionals testified about similar experiences at Grand Meridian Properties, being questioned about payment methods, asked for additional identification, or subjected to security screenings that white guests never faced. Each incident had been reported and dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated events. Current and former Grand Meridian employees provided devastating testimony about the company culture. A former night manager described explicit instructions to keep an eye on certain types of guests and report any suspicious behavior. Standards that were never clearly defined but consistently applied to Black customers. A housekeeping supervisor testified about different service standards for rooms occupied by Black guests versus white guests. The most powerful moment came when Dr. Sarah Wright presented her research findings. Her data analysis revealed statistical patterns that made discrimination undeniable. Black guests waited an average of 18 minutes longer for service, were 300% more likely to be asked for additional verification, and received 40% fewer amenities despite paying identical rates. The numbers transformed individual experiences into systemic evidence. "This isn't about isolated incidents or employee mistakes," Dr. Wright testified. "This is about institutional policies and cultural practices that systematically discriminate against Black customers, while providing plausible deniability for individual employees." Judge Santos listened intently throughout the proceedings, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions that revealed her understanding of both legal precedents and social realities. When Grand Meridian's attorneys attempted to dismiss the statistical evidence as coincidental patterns, she interrupted sharply. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that a 300% difference in verification requests is coincidental? That 18-minute service delays affecting exclusively Black customers represent random variation? This court deals in evidence, not convenient explanations." The judge's questions grew increasingly skeptical of Grand Meridian's defense as the evidence mounted. When Richardson argued that my consulting expertise made me unreasonably sensitive to normal business interactions, Judge Santos responded with barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Richardson, are you suggesting that professional expertise in hospitality disqualifies someone from receiving equal treatment as a customer? Or that understanding discrimination makes someone's experiences less credible rather than more reliable?" By the third day of hearings, Grand Meridian's defense had collapsed entirely. Their attempts to discredit my character were overwhelmed by evidence of institutional discrimination. Their claims about isolated incidents were destroyed by statistical patterns and multiple witness testimonies. Most damaging, their own internal communications revealed deliberate strategies to avoid accountability rather than address systemic problems. The moment of ultimate vindication came when Judge Santos delivered her ruling. The evidence presented in this case reveals not merely individual acts of discrimination, but systematic policies and practices designed to provide different levels of service based on customers' race. The defendant's attempts to reframe legitimate complaints as professional misconduct represent an additional form of retaliation that this court cannot and will not tolerate. She continued with language that would be quoted in civil rights casebooks for years to come. Institutions that profit from public accommodation have a legal and moral obligation to serve all customers equally. When they fail in that obligation, they cannot escape accountability by attacking the character of those brave enough to demand justice. The monetary damages were substantial: $150,000 in compensatory damages for professional harm and emotional distress, plus $300,000 in punitive damages designed to deter future discrimination. But the non-monetary remedies were even more significant. Grand Meridian was required to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training, establish independent monitoring of service disparities, and create accessible reporting mechanisms for future complaints. Most importantly, the court appointed an independent monitor to ensure compliance for 3 years, with quarterly reports that would be public record. Grand Meridian couldn't simply write a check and continue discriminating. They were required to demonstrate measurable changes in their operations. As Judge Santos concluded her ruling, the courtroom erupted in applause that the bailiff made no effort to stop. My parents embraced me with tears in their eyes, understanding that this victory honored every indignity they'd faced while building better opportunities for their children. Tamika whispered in my ear, "Your grandmother would be so proud," and I felt the connection to generations of Black women who'd fought similar battles with fewer resources and less support. The victory was complete, public, and transformative. Grand Meridian's attempt to destroy my reputation had backfired spectacularly, establishing me as a national expert on hospitality discrimination and institutional accountability. Justice had been served not just for me, but for every Black person who'd been made to feel unwelcome in spaces they had every right to occupy. The immediate aftermath of the court victory was emotionally complex in ways I hadn't anticipated. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by media and supporters, I felt simultaneously vindicated and exhausted. Winning felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for months, but the toll of fighting institutional racism while maintaining my professional life had been enormous. The community celebration that evening at Mount Calvary Baptist Church was exactly what my spirit needed. Pastor Williams opened the gathering with a prayer acknowledging both the victory and the ongoing struggle. "Lord, we thank you for Michelle's courage and for the justice achieved today. Help us remember that individual victories are meaningful only when they strengthen our collective fight for equality." The church fellowship hall filled with familiar faces and new allies who joined our cause. Mrs. Henderson, my childhood public speaking coach, sat at the piano playing spirituals while 3 generations of Black hospitality workers shared their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Tamika's 7-year-old daughter presented me with a handmade card that read, "Thank you for fighting for us," reminding me that this victory belonged to future generations who would benefit from increased accountability. But the personal healing process was just beginning. The trauma of experiencing discrimination, then fighting institutional retaliation while maintaining professional composure, had taken a psychological toll I was only starting to acknowledge. Angela Robinson, a therapist who specialized in racial trauma, helped me understand that victory doesn't erase the harm caused by discrimination. It creates space for healing while demanding ongoing vigilance. Within weeks, Grand Meridian's court-mandated changes began implementation. The independent monitor, retired federal judge Patricia Coleman, established quarterly review processes that required detailed reporting on service delivery metrics, employee training effectiveness, and customer complaint resolution. The transparency was unprecedented. Every service disparity had to be documented, analyzed, and addressed with specific corrective actions. The anti-discrimination training program we developed became a model for the hospitality industry. Unlike typical diversity workshops that focused on feel-good messaging, our curriculum addressed unconscious bias through scenario-based learning and quantitative assessment. Employees learned to recognize their own biases, while managers developed systems for identifying and correcting discriminatory patterns in real time. The new reporting mechanisms created safe channels for both employees and customers to address discrimination without fear of retaliation. Anonymous hotlines, online reporting systems, and third-party mediation services ensured that future complaints would be investigated thoroughly rather than buried in bureaucratic processes. Most significantly, Grand Meridian was required to publish annual diversity and inclusion reports that included detailed statistics on service delivery, employment practices, and complaint resolution. The public accountability meant they couldn't simply train employees then ignore implementation. Their progress was monitored by civil rights organizations, industry associations, and the media. The ripple effects extended far beyond Grand Meridian. Other major hotel chains proactively contacted me about consulting engagements, understanding that public discrimination cases create liability risks that prevention strategies could minimize. The National Hotel Association revised their industry standards to include specific anti-discrimination protocols, while hospitality schools began incorporating my case study into their curriculum. My consulting practice expanded dramatically, but with a new focus on systemic change rather than surface-level diversity initiatives. Clients weren't just seeking compliance training. They wanted comprehensive assessments of their operations, identification of discriminatory patterns, and sustainable solutions that would withstand legal scrutiny. The work was more meaningful because it addressed root causes rather than symptoms. The personal growth aspects of this journey surprised me most. Fighting institutional racism had forced me to develop leadership skills I didn't know I possessed. Speaking at conferences, mentoring other discrimination victims, and building coalitions across different communities required me to step into public advocacy roles that extended far beyond hospitality consulting. 6 months after the court victory, I received an invitation that crystallized the transformation. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund asked me to join their board of directors, recognizing my expertise in corporate accountability and institutional change. Accepting meant expanding my advocacy beyond hospitality into broader civil rights work, but it felt like a natural evolution of the fight I'd been forced to undertake. The ongoing vigilance required by systemic change became clear as we monitored Grand Meridian's progress. While their compliance improved dramatically, creating sustainable culture change required constant attention and course correction. Employee turnover meant training had to be continuous rather than one-time events. New management required education about legal obligations and moral imperatives. Customer feedback revealed subtle forms of bias that required ongoing attention, but the progress was measurable and meaningful. Service delivery disparities decreased by 78% within the first year. Customer complaints about discrimination dropped by 85%, while employee reports of bias incidents increased initially, a positive sign that people felt safe reporting problems rather than suffering in silence. The Independent Monitor's quarterly reports documented consistent improvement across all metrics. Perhaps most importantly, other discrimination victims began reaching out for advice and support. My experience became a roadmap for people facing similar retaliation and institutional resistance. The legal precedents established by our case made future lawsuits easier to pursue, while the publicity encouraged other victims to speak up rather than suffer in silence. The victory was never just about me. It was about demonstrating that institutional racism could be challenged successfully when individuals had adequate support and strategic advocacy. Every person who contacted me for advice, every organization that implemented similar accountability measures, every policy change inspired by our case represented expanding circles of impact that honored the struggle while creating lasting change. A year later, standing in the same Grand Meridian lobby where I'd been discriminated against, I watched Jennifer Martinez welcome a Black family with genuine warmth and efficiency. She'd completed extensive bias training, participated in cultural competency workshops, and learned to recognize her own unconscious prejudices. The change wasn't perfect, but it was real and measurable. This is what justice looks like in practice. Not just punishment for past wrongs, but transformation that creates better outcomes for everyone. What I learned fighting the Grand Meridian's institutional racism created a roadmap that I now share with every Black person facing similar discrimination. The lessons aren't just about legal strategy. They're about psychological preparation, community building, and turning individual injustice into collective empowerment. First, recognize discrimination early and document everything. The gaslighting that follows discriminatory incidents is designed to make you question your own perceptions and minimize clear violations of your rights. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, because your lived experience as a Black person has trained you to recognize subtle forms of bias that others might miss or dismiss. Take screenshots, save emails, record dates and times, note witnesses. Your documentation becomes the foundation for accountability. Second, build your coalition before you need it. The support I received from family, friends, professional networks, and civil rights organizations was essential for both practical assistance and emotional resilience. Don't try to fight institutional racism alone. Connect with others who faced similar challenges, join professional associations that advocate for people of color, and maintain relationships with mentors who can provide strategic guidance when discrimination occurs. Third, understand that retaliation is almost inevitable when you challenge systemic bias. Institutions will protect discriminatory behavior by attacking your character, questioning your motives, and attempting to isolate you professionally and socially. Prepare mentally for this backlash by developing emotional regulation strategies and building support systems that can sustain you through extended conflicts. Fourth, leverage all available resources strategically. Civil rights organizations, legal aid societies, professional associations, and community advocacy groups exist specifically to support people facing discrimination. Research your options before you need them, understand the different types of assistance available, and don't hesitate to request help when discrimination occurs. Remember that these organizations depend on people like us reporting problems and seeking accountability. Most importantly, remember that your individual fight connects to a broader struggle for racial justice that extends across generations. When you challenge discrimination, you're not just seeking personal vindication, you're creating precedents and opportunities that will benefit other Black people who face similar situations. Your courage becomes part of a collective resistance that weakens institutional racism and strengthens community empowerment. The psychological aspects of fighting discrimination require particular attention because the process is designed to exhaust and demoralize you into giving up. Maintain your self-care practices, seek professional counseling when needed, and remember that your worth isn't determined by how institutions treat you. Discrimination reflects their moral failures, not your personal inadequacies. Use your cultural strength throughout the process. The resilience, strategic thinking, and community orientation that characterize Black survival in America are powerful tools for fighting institutional bias. Draw on the wisdom of ancestors who faced worse circumstances with fewer resources, and channel their determination into your own struggle for justice. Don't let anyone convince you to be reasonable about unreasonable treatment. Respectability politics are designed to make you complicit in your own oppression by suggesting that polite acceptance of discrimination is more admirable than direct resistance. You have the right to demand equal treatment, and institutions have legal and moral obligations to provide it. Finally, transform your pain into power by using your experience to help others. Every person who successfully challenges discrimination makes it easier for the next person to seek accountability. Share your story, mentor others facing similar challenges, and support organizations that fight institutional racism. Your individual victory becomes meaningful only when it contributes to collective liberation. This work isn't easy, but it's essential. Every time we accept discrimination quietly, we enable institutions to continue harming other people who look like us. When we fight back strategically and persistently, we create accountability that protects entire communities. The Grand Meridian case didn't end discrimination in hospitality, but it established precedents and procedures that make future discrimination more difficult to hide and easier to address. That's how systemic change happens, us through individual acts of courage that accumulate into collective power. Your struggle matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable, and your community is ready to support you when you're ready to fight for justice. If this story resonates with your experiences, please share where you're watching from in the comments below. Let's build connections across communities and industries, because discrimination affects all of us, and resistance requires all of us. Subscribe to join others who understand that individual liberation and collective freedom are inseparable goals that require ongoing commitment. Together we're stronger than any institution that tries to diminish our humanity. Together we win.